Hello and welcome to the Public Square, a show that explores public affairs and religious liberty issues that affect our nation and beyond. I'm your host, Paul Goodridge, and I'm the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the South Central Conference of Seventh-day Adventists located in Nashville, Tennessee. In each episode, we'll talk to people who are on the front lines of the fight for civil and religious liberty. My goal in every episode is to inform about issues that directly and indirectly have an impact on everyday life, ignite meaningful thought and reflection, inspire my audience to action, and integrate faith principles in how we relate to others. Today, we're going to talk about the various policies, proposals, issues, and agendas connected to the upcoming election and beyond. We will be defining terms and positions and practices. And while we won't be talking about people and personalities or parties per se, we will talk about how policies impact and could impact our lives. We want to look at some of the challenges and all opportunities that impact our ability or our desire to vote. And so, as usual, I want to encourage you to subscribe, to like, to share this, to let somebody know that we are on. And thank you for joining us. And let's meet in the public square. My guests this evening approach this topic of the issues at stake in this upcoming election and voting rights from differing perspectives. My first guest is Dr. Denise Shaver. Dr. Shaver brings over 25 years of experience in the field of education, both in the classroom and as an administrator. She currently serves as an administrator at the Pratt Institute. However, she also serves as an adjunct instructor of history, specializing in African American and Seventh-day Adventist history at Oakwood University. Dr. Shaver, welcome to the Public Square.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Jason Hines, assistant professor at Advent Health University. Dr. Hines is an attorney who practiced commercial litigation in Philadelphia for pharmaceutical companies. He's also a sought-after presenter and speaker on the subject of religious liberty and constitutional law. Dr. Hines, welcome to the Public Square.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And finally, we have attorney Jennifer Gray Woods. Attorney Woods currently serves as legal counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty at the Lake Union Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. However, prior to working for the church, she was an attorney for the United States Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C., and a healthcare law and an attorney at a healthcare law firm in Los Angeles, California. Attorney Woods, welcome to the Public Square.
Thank you.
So I wanted to kind of dive in, generally speaking, and you all know that there is an election coming up. Maybe you weren't aware, maybe you didn't know, but there's an election coming up, and there's a number of different terms and ideas and policies and agenda items that are floating around in terms of what will take place depending on which side gets into the White House. So from each of your perspective, I want you to just share what you think, what are some of the policies or proposals or issues at stake that you find to be most important that maybe our general public may not be fully aware. And I'll begin with you, Dr. Hines. Kind of just give an overview of what you think are some of the important issues or agenda items we need to keep an eye on.
I love the fact that you crafted a nice, tight, very directed question that we can all just kind of get on. I mean, there are a lot of things there are a lot of directions that we can take this. I think, obviously, from my perspective, as somebody who's really interested in church state separation and religious liberty, one of the things that I'm particularly on the lookout for is a small piece of Project 2025. And I know we're going to delve into more detail with that.
Hmm.
But one of the things that I'm very interested in is this idea of allowing religious discrimination in the public square. So, for the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years, there's been this legal fight about can people who are involved in commerce discriminate based on their religious beliefs.
Hmm.
And that question has been somewhat settled, but not quite. And one of the things that's in Project 2025 as a major platform of their agenda is the ability to allow religious discrimination. So, for example, if you walk into a shop of someone who thinks that people who are Adventist are in a cult, and they decide that they don't want to sell to you. That's now something that can happen. And
Mm.
or if it goes through and if the right people are in office and if they get their agenda passed and all of those types of things, that's now, we could be living in that type of world. And so, from my particular lens, that's something that's particularly important to me, not just because we all happen to be members of a religious minority. We forget that sometimes. But
Mhm.
there are a lot of us who are members of religious minorities who could find ourselves being discriminated against if this particular version of of ideology comes into office. And while that's not one of the bright line things, I think it is one of the things that has the potential to affect everyday people in ways that we don't think about at first blush
Mhm.
until you're actually, sort of deep down in the weeds on it.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, we certainly will kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts of Project 2025 a little later. Attorney Gray Woods, in your opinion, what are some of the things that you think most of us are not quite aware of that maybe we should be paying attention to?
Sure, and I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle here, and that is, I think most of us, if we watch the news at all, we're kind of aware of what's going on nationally with the national elections and the
Mhm.
platforms and whatnot. But I think that most of us don't spend enough time looking at the state and local elections and the issues that are
Mhm.
at play there. And I've been guilty of this as well. Like you go into the ballot booth and you know who you're going to vote for president. You might know who you're going to vote for Congress, but you get down the ticket to some of these other issues and some state issues and local issues, and it's like, oh, I didn't even know this was on the ballot. And I
Mm.
think that we really need to do a better job of staying informed, because this is really where the day-to-day impact comes into play, right? The
Mhm.
things that are voted on at the local level, they're going to have immediate impact on us. And there are a whole host of issues depending on where you are in the country. And so, I think that's really where I see the impact of these elections. Of course, the national elections, like those matter as well. But I think that we've all heard a lot about that. We
Mhm.
can all do a better job of educating ourselves even on those things, Project 2025 and what that means. But I think that most of us haven't even scratched the surface as far as our local elections are concerned.
Okay, okay, thank you. And we'll also talk about that in terms of especially kind of the impact that it has on everyday lives. Dr. Shaver,
Mhm.
what should we be paying attention to that maybe we're not as it relates to this upcoming election?
Well, thank you so much, Pastor Goodrich. We definitely need to be looking at the erosion and the attack on voting rights.
Mm.
There's an agenda to pretty much roll back a lot of the gains that we've made as a result of the 1965 Voting Rights Acts and the equal protections, Roe v. Wade, and things that have happened as a result of the Civil Rights Act. There's an intentional agenda to roll all of those back. And that's very important. It's not just any group, it's holistically trying to attack freedom and equality for lots of different people. I think that's, for me, the most pressing issue. If we don't have the right to vote, then we're not really at the table, are we?
Mm, mm. So, okay, so let's kind of dive into that a little bit more. You are our resident historian, so kind of just give us an overview of maybe even the history of the attempt to thwart or undercut the right to vote for every, eligible human being.
Great. So as my presentation will show right now, we start talking about, it's your vote. And we take voting and the right to vote very, very lightly because we've had it for a long time, but it hasn't always been the case. So in our next slide, I'm going to talk about, what happened. Um, when you look at this picture, I just recently moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and I went to vote. And you can't really see what's going on, but I put two pictures of the reflection. And the reflection of the office for the commission to vote in Shelby County, it's actually housed on a prison campus. So look at the dichotomy of the commission for election on the same property that the large county jail is. Now, right now in the United States, there are 8 states that are trying to make it permanently impossible for anybody who's been in jail to ever vote, and another 14 states that you have to come out of jail, probation, everything. So years after you come out of jail that you can vote. And at only 2 states allow people who are in prison currently to vote. Next slide. So we have to think about the history of America. And when we talk about America, we have to talk about how it started. This presentation is primarily coming from a book that I've read recently called Anti-Democratic Inside the Far Right's 50-year, five, it went, it was supposed to be 50-year plot to control American elections. And so next slide, we'll talk about the history and just a brief overview. So when you think about racism, when you think about discrimination in America, remember, the first slaves came to America in 1619, but the country does not have its first birthday, right? Until 157 years later, 1776. That's when America becomes a country. So slavery was here for over 150 years before we were actually a country. In 1787, even to ratify the Constitution, they had to pass the 3/5 clause because the southern states had so many blacks, but they didn't have citizenship. So they said, well, we'll have a 3/5 clause. So every 3 slaves will equal 1 person, so that we can kind of count them for representation, ironically, for the Electoral College and the House of Representatives. So that's our relationship with voting in America. It's not until 1870, with the 15th Amendment, that Black men have the right to vote. And we know that women didn't have the right to vote in America until 1920, the 19th Amendment. So as soon as we got the right, at least Black men got the right to vote, immediately there were restrictions and backlash, not wanting them to be able to vote. We'll talk about that in a minute. 1965, we have the most comprehensive Civil Rights Act, and that's the 1965 Voting Rights Acts. And the next slide, you're going to see how these immediate backlashes in 1870, they started making poll taxes, grandfather clause. The grandfather clause said if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote. Well, that eliminated every single slave, right? And literacy test and violence. Of course, we know the Ku Klux Klan. Next slide. So what we're going to see next is that immediately after 1965, the conservatives came up with an agenda. In 1972, not long after, right? They decide and they come up with a 50-year plan, according to Daley, the author of this book, to undo all of the gains made with equal protection under the law from the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and to reduce our rights. Next slide. We start talking about what the strategy looks like. And so I'll talk about the specifics really quickly, but they start with these very heavily funded organizations like the Heritage Foundation that came about in 1972. And it was bankrolled. And when I say bankrolled, I mean billionaires put millions and billions of dollars into the Heritage Foundation to promote this conservative agenda. And then we have the Federalist Society that, again, heavily funded by billionaires, right, to take over law schools and to influence law professors and students to actually come up with a group of conservative legal thinkers that would eventually be leaders in the field in several decades. And they were successful. The Supreme Court, 6 out of the 9 Supreme Court judges come from that Federalist Society background. Next slide. So after this, they employ a strategy. Ironically, they used the civil rights strategy, where a lot of people don't know that was a 36-year plan strategy, right? Martin Luther King didn't just have a dream. They planned from 1936 to 1955. So it's a 25-year strategy to implement. And the conservatives said, we're going to do exactly what we do. We're going to fight this through the courts, but we're going to take back over the courts. So the Federalist Societies, working with the law schools and the law students, right? The conservatives are putting litigants in that will come up with these conservative Supreme Court rulings. Well, not the rulings, but the actual fight, the case. And then they're going to put conservative federal judges on every level. So when those cases come through, they'll pass. Sounds familiar? We're going through it right now. Let's go to the next slide. And quickly, we're going to talk about the results. So voting rights are start to be undermined. Preclearance is a protection in the 1965 Voting Rights Act that said if a legislator, if a local state government wants to change voting rights, they have to get permission. It has to be pre-cleared from the Department of Justice. As soon as that was passed, Mississippi starts fighting. 2-3 years later, 4 years later, they're fighting. And between 1969 and 2006, they tried to change the law 169 times. We have the voter registration reauthorization. Every time it has to be reauthorized, they try to weaken it a little bit more, and they question it more. Do we really need this? Haven't things changed? Aren't we like a multiracial society? So that's a way to undermine it. In 2004, the Citizens United, it was a Supreme Court ruling. You've heard this word super PACs before. You really couldn't fund campaigns the way you can do it now. But now millionaires and billionaires can fund and influence a campaign. And that's also undermining this whole system. 2008, the Supreme Court started allowing for these restrictions. Indiana was able to have the strictest ID law, and now lots of states had followed suit. And then finally, 2013, Montgomery, Alabama redistricts, right, on the local level, a Black area that was 71% Black for voting, and they redistrict it overnight, and it reduces it to 30% Black. And they push this, and it passes all the lower courts and goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says it's fine. And all of a sudden, preclearance is no longer protected. Next slide. So all of these things now have gotten us to where we are right now. Ruth Bader, she said that allowing preclearance to be affected is like putting away your umbrella in the middle of a thunderstorm just because you're not getting wet. And that's what's happening. The people that are not getting wet, they feel like it's not raining, and they're taking away the protections that were helping people who are getting drenched. And so gerrymandering, where they're redistricting, is taking place all over. Stricter voter registration laws, again, these IDs that poor people don't have access to, even just moving the polls, or closing them early. All of these strategies to reduce the vote. And this is the last and final slide. And this is what I want you to remember, that it's not getting better. And if we do not fight for our rights now, they may disappear.
Wow. Thank you for that introduction. So as you were sharing, and as I was thinking about what you were saying and the impact, I thought about both of you in terms of Dr. Hines and Attorney Woods, because you went to law school. Did you see any of this in terms of some of the with the professors or the presentations or arguments that were laid?
I'll let
Jen, I
Jason
don't know
go first.
about you. Thanks, Jen. Jen and I also went to the same law school, so you're not
Okay.
going to get a ton of diversity of thought here. But I think what you saw, and now we're talking about, if we're talking about this as a 50-year plan, when we were in law school, that's about 30 years into this 50-year plan. So what you saw, I think, at the time was that there was still a lot of disbelief that a plan like this could be successful. I think one of the things that surprised a lot of rank and file people was this misunderstanding that legal decisions are not necessarily set in stone. That when justices cycle out, when you get new people in, there is the ability, especially at the Supreme Court level, to just decide, well, we don't want to do that anymore. And the famous saying about the Supreme Court is that the Supreme Court is not final because it's infallible because it's final. And because they're the last word on everything, once they say something is the way that it is, it's that way until the Supreme Court decides something different. And so I think, when we were in law school, there were people who were sounding the alarm saying, look, this could be coming. Um, but I don't think a lot of people believed it until the Shelby County decision, which Dr. Shaver was just talking about in 2013, when they actually did away with preclearance, and everybody said, "Oh, this is a serious thing." And by the time that happened, you're on the mat looking up at the ceiling trying to figure out what happened.
Mm.
And so it was shocking to some, but I think others thought, no, this is the worst thing that could happen, and this is what people are aiming for. But a lot of people didn't think they would be successful.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of change in the last 10 years. We've seen longstanding precedent just kind of done away with, and it is, as Jason said, the Supreme Court is final, but who's in the Supreme Court will really determine what that final say is, right? Like
Hmm.
they've done away with longstanding precedent on many issues and just said we're going to have new standards now. So we're under this new era, but it's been a long time coming, and I think that's what I'm taking away from your message, Dr. Shaver.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know what schools you went to, so please don't feel offended. But the book specifically says that they really targeted those Ivy League schools, right? Because they wanted to get the people that had the best chance of being those leaders, right? The people with the money and the people with the connections. And that's where they infused a lot of that focus, because those would likely be the ones that would have access to the Supreme Court and federal courts and things of that nature. So that's also an important thought. They went to these elite schools and really infiltrated them hard.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah, and you're right. We do see the effects of this because we understand in terms of, well, I guess the biggest thing is the Roe versus Wade, and how that we thought that was settled. It was, but then suddenly and I shouldn't even say suddenly, because based on what you're sharing, Dr. Shaver, this has been the plan. This has been the plan, and it takes certain individuals to promote it, certain individuals to co-sign it, to agree with it, and next thing you know, so so there's another kind of a big agenda that we're hearing now, and Jason, Dr. Hines, you referred to it earlier in terms of Project 2025. Um, that seems to get a lot of attention in terms of what it may say, what it does say, what it could mean, etc. And so, Attorney Woods, just kind of share with us a little bit, for those of us who may not be fully familiar with Project 2025. What is it? Where does it come from? Does it have anything to do with, as what Dr. Shaver was saying, in terms of an agenda to, um, take us back to, a time, I don't know. Talk to us.
Sure. So I'm just going to give an overview and a background of what Project
Okay.
2025 is. And I want to start with the fact that for most of us, when we hear about Project 2025, we think about that mandate, right? That 900-page document.
Hmm.
But actually, it's bigger than that. It's
Mm,
actually based on 4 pillars. And the mandate for leadership, the conservative promise that was published back in April of 2023, is just one of those pillars of Project 2025. And if you want more information on it, I encourage people to go to the website so you can see exactly what they're talking about. It's project2025.org, and it's spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation, which is something that an organization that Dr. Shaver just talked about a couple minutes ago. So it's important to know the source of this whole project. But they're only one piece, like they're spearheading this, but it's actually been signed on by over 100 different organizations, including a number of religious organizations that have signed on to this movement. So you have Christian schools like Liberty, you have Dobson's Family Institute, you have the National Association of Christian Lawmakers. So there's definitely a religious component to all that's going on here. And I think, Jason alluded to that earlier as well. So back to the project itself, it's based on 4 pillars. And the first pillar is the policy agenda. That's what I think most of us think about. It's over 900 pages. It has 30 chapters dealing with every aspect of the federal government. And they had over 400 contributors to this document. And who contributed to the document is also something of importance, because these aren't, these are people that we've heard of in past administrations.
mm,
These are people who have advised past administrations, people who are political players in Washington. So they've been listened to. People have relied on them for their advice and their guidance in the past. And there's no reason to think that people will not be relying on them for advice and guidance in the future, depending on which administration comes into
Hmm.
the power. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is this personnel database, and I think that this is also very unique and a little bit troubling. It's allowing candidates basically to build their professional profiles and to put them in this database, kind of like a conservative LinkedIn, so that if a new administration comes into power, they already have you know people ready to become political appointees or to serve in the government. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar is training. So they want to train these individuals through this thing called the Presidential Administration Academy. It's an online educational system that's taught by experts that are within this coalition. Again, you saw there's over 100 organizations that have signed on and many individuals who are part of this. So it's to help anyone who's new to government to understand how it functions or how they want the government to function under this new system, and to provide them training so that on day one they're ready to implement some of this policy that we see in this 900-page document. And then the last pillar is this 180-day playbook. So under this project, they're saying, hey, we want to make sure that we see tangible changes early on in the new administration. So these aren't just lofty goals that they have, but they have a plan to implement. So we need to take that seriously, that these aren't it's not just a wish list. Here's how we're going to do the things that are in this document. So I want to spend some time kind of focusing in on this first pillar, this 900-page
Hmm.
document. And there have been playbooks like this before. This is not the first time that the Heritage Foundation has come up with a mandate. In fact, they had one for the Reagan administration when he came to the presidency. So it's an ever evolving mandate. But again, I want to talk about some of the people that were involved in creating the playbook. One of them
Hmm.
being Russell Voigt, who was a former OMB official, and he was also the director of the Republican Platform Committee, and he is a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist. So again, this is the person who is kind of organizing all of this, a Christian nationalist, and you can see that the running through the document itself, right? These undertones of being a Christian nation. The playbook itself has four promises that it's as its basis. The first one is to restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. And I'm just quoting these as they are. So it's not me
Hmm.
putting words here. These are the words in the document itself. The second promise is to dismantle the administrative state and return self governance to the American people. The third is to defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. And the fourth is to secure our God given individual rights to live freely. And they say what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. So, you know, especially promise number two, dismantling the administrative state, right? That's concerning to me. Um, and they talk about the fact that, what they really want to do is do away kind of with the civil service and have political appointees so that you are they're consolidating power, right, under the president is what they're proposing here.
Hmm.
The civil service employees, they serve a purpose, right? They provide consistency in the government, they provide expertise. And when you do away with the civil service, then all you have really are yes men and yes
Yes.
women, right?
Yeah.
It does away with checks and balances within the executive branch itself. And, you know, it's concerning here that, they're saying they want to dismantle the administrative state, and this conservative LinkedIn is how they're planning on doing that. Um, there's so many aspects of Project 2025 that are concerning, but one of them that I'm going to talk about is this this undertone of us being a Christian nation. And you see this not only where they talk about Sabbath rest under the Department of Labor proposals that they have, and they say, this is Sabbath rest is important. It's a Judeo-Christian value, and we're going to bring it back. All those things, but they also um, talk about faith groups. Let me find the one that says they're talking about with health and human services. They say they should protect faith-based grant recipients from religious liberty violations that maintain a biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. The problem that I have with that sentence is that they talk about faith groups, right, which should be an inclusive statement,
Hmm.
but then they focus in only on biblically based. Well, that is really only talking about Christian groups, right? But faith groups goes beyond Christianity. But
Hmm.
throughout the document, you see um, this interchange of biblically based and Christian based, and it's very clear they're not talking about all religions or protecting all religions or all faith traditions. They're talking about protecting and promoting Christianity.
Hmm.
So I think I've talked enough at this point, but we can we can go into more detail. But it's a very fascinating, to put it kindly, it's a very fascinating document that I think everyone should familiarize themselves with, because depending on who comes into power, these things could become a reality.
Yeah. So, Dr. Hines, as one who has been a staunch defender of and religious liberty and the separation of church and state, how do you see that potentially being threatened by this Project 2025 document?
Yeah, it's a problem, Pastor. The the separation of church and state, it has always sort of meant two things in constitutional law. One, and they sometimes tend to be in tension with one another. One of them is the ability of religious adherents to live as freely as they possibly can within the bounds of their religious belief.
Hmm.
So obviously, we don't get to do things that would be problematic. From a general perspective. So, for example, if your religious belief tells you that you should sacrifice children like Abraham wanted to sacrifice Isaac, you don't get to do that. But
Hmm.
you get to be as free as you possibly can in terms of the exercise of your religion. And then the other thing that our constitutional law has often done is said our government should not be promoting any one particular type of religion through the force of law. And so when you hear some of these things that are going on, or the things that are being promoted or proposed under Project 2025, you see sort of these clear, what we would call establishment clause violations, where we're saying we are looking to do this particular thing and have this particular law because we are Christian. We want to make sure that we're promoting a Christian definition of what a family is. We want to make sure that we're promoting a Christian definition of what the Sabbath is, which should really sort of raise the alarms of every Adventist. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
good traditional Adventist eschatology, to use a big word, is big on this idea of the Sabbath being a centerpiece of what is happening in terms of religious persecution. And so when you finally see this in a document like this, you realize that we're not that far away from these types of things if certain people end up in office. And let me be clear. The person who would do this is not somebody who's coming in with any plans of his own. So, he has concepts of plans according to him, but I don't think he even has that. And
No.
so when you have a ready playbook for somebody who doesn't have ideas and thoughts of their own, you're creating an environment
Mm-hmm.
where this type of thing can very easily become the centerpiece agenda for people who support that particular ideology, that support that particular framework. And I'm glad that Attorney Woods was willing to sort of say the words Christian nationalism, because I think sometimes they end up sort of being this boogeyman. But I mean, it really is what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are very deliberate in their ideology. They're very set on what their goals are in terms of having their form of Christianity be the
Mhm.
enforced law of the land. And it's a thing that we have to begin to take really, really seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I just want to point out, even, oh, go on.
Well, I just wanted to interject that Dr. Jason, your points are so important. I just heard just recently two sermons from Pastor Shane Anderson at Pioneer Memorial at Andrews and Wesley Knight, just both of their sermons last week. I encourage you all to listen to. They're both about voting. They're both about this whole thing. What is Christianity? What is our role as Christians? And all of what you all are saying, just to remind ourselves from our lens and our vantage point, right? Not just as citizens, but as Adventists and as Christians, how we should be looking at all of these things. So I thought those were good.
Yeah, and I just wanted to come to a point, I know that um, I'm gonna say, Donald Trump, this is his administration. That's the one that would be implementing Project 2025.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's where the worry is. Okay, so I'm gonna go on and say that. And he has said, well, I've never heard of this before, right? But I think we have to be very careful with believing that, because this is not, again, the first mandate that Heritage Foundation has put out, and they had the 2016 mandate. And the research shows that within 1 year, 64% of that mandate was implemented or proposed or adopted by
Mm-hmm.
that administration.
Mm.
So we have to be wise, right? And understanding that despite what he may be saying, the truth of the matter is, because of the people that have promoted Project 2025, because of past implementation of these mandates, it's it's a little bit hard to believe that he has not heard of this and that he would not be potentially influenced by this.
I,
Uh,
I want to disagree with you, Jen, and here's why. If he, I don't believe him to be a reader, and so um, so now, has he heard of it? Of course he has, but does he know what's in it? I don't know that he does,
I
and
agree with
and
you
I
on
get
that.
the impression that you could pass 85 things that are in Project 2025. He would agree with all of them and not realize he's passing Project 2025.
Right.
Like that. I think part of the reason why this plan can work is because he doesn't know what's in it. And what is happening instead is, as we were talking about before, this army of political appointees that they are creating intentionally are going to be the people who end up getting appointed and then end up carrying this out in the very same way that the Federalist Society created an army of judges that you didn't even have to think about who they were. You could just go down the list and go, okay, let's appoint that one, let's appoint that one, let's appoint that one. And now all of a sudden you have a conservative judiciary across the country that is backstopping all of this stuff legally. And here's the thing that I want to make clear, because Pastor Goodridge wanted us to sort of drill down a little bit. Yes, a lot of this seems very esoteric. It feels like, a nerd fight, right? Like we're just talking about academic things. These are things that will affect your everyday, in the sense that you're dealing with schools that won't have funding. And if you think you can afford private school in this country, then by all means, go ahead and try it.
Mm.
But it may affect where your children go to school. It's going to affect your health care. It's going to affect your ability to literally to go into a shop and buy things. These are the types of things that are a part of our everyday, that when you see what they're planning for the Department of Agriculture, you see what they're planning for the Department of Education, you see what they're planning for Health and Human Services. The dismantling of the administrative state means that businesses and people with means can come in, take these things over, and price you out of them. and
Yep.
and that at the end of the day is certainly what some people want. And what the administrative state has always done is protected the ability of minorities, people of color, poor people, people who have histories of oppression. They have protected the ability of us to have some level of access to these types of things. In fact, they have protected the blessings of liberty for people like us. That's what the state has done. And what Project 2025 and the people behind it are attempting to do is dismantle those protections for us.
Mhm.
And that's going to affect you in a number of different ways. And it's not just an esoteric discussion about Trump or Republicans or Democrats or anybody else. It's about your everyday and whether you're going to be able to live the life of freedom in America that's supposed to be promised to everybody.
And I want to say that applies to both groups. Like one thing you said applies to both parties, right? And that is, we're at the end of the day, we're not electing a person, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Whether we elect Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, we are electing a
And agenda.
platform at the end of the
Agenda.
day,
And
an
Yes.
agenda.
agenda at the end of the day. And the
Yep.
Democratic Party has an agenda. You can go online and read it. The Republican Party has their official agenda. The Heritage Foundation has their agenda. But that's what we're actually electing, because these individuals are not going to be implementing all of this on their own, whether it's because they haven't read it or don't care, or just because they rely on advisors, right? They're going to rely on people within their party and within their leadership team to implement the agenda. And so it can't just be a personality contest. We have to actually be informed of what these agendas are. And there are things on both sides. There are aspects of the agenda that I don't agree with, right?
Hmm.
But it's important to kind of weigh it all out and say, which is the lesser of two evils here?
Mhm.
I,
And
absolutely.
Woods, what you're saying is what I hear a lot of Christians struggling with. Adventists, oh, well, this group agrees with this, and I don't believe in that, right? And we have to look at the bigger picture, right? It's not that we agree with everything, because we don't agree with everything on either side, but it's who is still going to allow for the freedom for us to make those choices of what we agree with and what we don't agree with, and who are trying to restrict those freedoms so we don't get those choices, whether we agree with them or not. I think that's also something we have to keep at the forefront.
So I'm glad that we're kind of drilling down a little bit, and I kind of I think this is maybe a good segue to I want to play a video, for our audience and for you, and then I want to get your response and reaction to the video, because I think it really hits the nail on the head of where we're going now in terms of, listen, this is not just policies and agendas, etc. This is impacting actual everyday life. And so we'll play this video, and then I'm going to ask for your response and reaction after that.
Is more than half the world's healthcare resources, but we're ranked 43rd in the world for life expectancy. How did we get here? The political determinants of health include how we structure relationships, how we distribute resources, and how we administer power. What does this look like at the individual level? Take Jessica, for example. Jessica's 19. Her dad relies on mental health and substance use programs, but when these programs get cut, he becomes too difficult to live with. She leaves home. The neighborhood Jessica can afford has no grocery stores, limited public transit, and limited health care. To save money, policymakers changed the water source to a more polluted river. Jessica has a minimum wage job with no health insurance at a convenience store that offers free snacks while she works, which she takes advantage of because they're free. When Jessica becomes pregnant, she can't get health insurance because pregnancy is a pre-existing condition. And she doesn't realize that the salty, fatty snacks that she eats at work are bad for her baby. Jessica gets a ride to the closest clinic for a prenatal appointment, but the doctor is rushed and rude to her. She doesn't go back. Jessica develops preeclampsia and almost dies during her son's premature birth. He's born with cognitive defects because of poor diet, contaminated water source, and lack of access to prenatal care. As he grows up, Jessica learns that her school district doesn't have the resources to accommodate her son's special needs. He drops out after 8th grade and will repeat the cycle of poverty. Through Jessica's story, we begin to see how social determinants, environmental determinants, healthcare determinants, and behavioral health determinants take their toll on our lives. And Jessica's story shows us how political determinants supersede personal responsibility. Equity in our policies is a process and an outcome. Change comes when we can identify political champions at all levels and figure out how our most pressing issues align with their policies. For more actionable solutions to close the health gap, read The Political Determinants of Health by Daniel E. Dawes.
I want to get your response to the video.
It's overwhelming, or a reality, how many external forces affect our everyday lives that we do not have control of and sometimes are not even aware of. And it's easy to look at somebody's outcome, as they said, and say they made a series of bad choices. We don't want to eradicate and eliminate personal responsibility and accountability for our own actions. But despite that, there are external forces that affect those outcomes or are targeted in having them go in a particular direction.
You know, I think this goes back to what you were sharing in terms of Dr. Woods, where you were saying kind of your opening statement that we should be considering not just the general election once every 4 years in terms of who's going to be president of the United States, but our state, our local, even our city elections in terms of individuals who will either look to protect, our rights or our ability to have access to certain, uh, whether it's, where are you going to put the grocery store, which will either determine whether we're living in a food desert or not. Are you going to close the fire station that's close to us? And if you do, then that means that if we have a fire, instead of an ambulance coming in 2 or 3 or 5 minutes, we're now waiting 15, 20 minutes before an ambulance comes. So it's that type of granular thing that makes not just this election, but all elections so important, which goes back to your initial kind of presentation Dr. Shaver, this attack, this barrage on the ability to vote and the ability for certain groups to be able to vote so they can have a say in determining how their lives are. It is, yeah, it's insidious, and it's all encompassing.
The thing that struck me was how outside forces limit freedom by limiting your choices,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can say I had 3 or 4 ways to go on this, but all you had were a bunch of bad options. And there's a long history in the literature. One of my favorite authors, Paul Farmer, is a proponent, or does some anthropological work around this, the concept of what we call structural violence, the way that the systems and the structures of a society then limit your choices, such that when you find yourself in these bad positions, you can't go back and figure out where you went wrong. And that's because the decisions that could have improved your life were decisions not made by you. Not only were they not made by you, but they were made by people that you've never seen before,
Mm-hmm.
and they were made by people who did not have you in mind when they made them. And so it then becomes a question of, where do we put that power plant, or where do we put that refinery, and there's a long history of those types of things being placed in the neighborhoods of people who don't have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that sort of constricts people and creates these cycles of poverty, of inequality, such as and that video, of course, is just one example, but we literally have millions of examples of
Mhm.
people who, through no fault of their own, find themselves in these horrible, horrible stories, in these horrible, horrible positions. And yes, as you were saying, Pastor, it does come down to, in many cases, who is the head of your school board, who is the mayor of your town, who
Mhm.
is the governor of your state. I am in Florida. We talked a little bit off air about sort of being in the path of a hurricane, and when you look at the inability of even the federal government to come in and help, the people to blame for that are state officials.
Mm-hmm.
And if we had been thinking about that in 2018, when we allowed our governor to be elected, we'd be living in a different reality. But a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people weren't thinking about that at that time, or the ways that these things at the local level really do affect your everyday, in ways that even the federal elections, while they're sexier and they get more play, they're not the closest to you. And so we have to be thinking about all of it, as Attorney Wood said before.
I think about from that video the systems in place, right? And you talked about people not having a voice, and it's like, this is the time. Every election is the time for us to have our voice. And for
Mm-hmm.
those of us who are able to, I think we need to take that responsibility of the vote seriously, because as Dr. Shaver talked about, there have been campaigns and a history of people trying to disenfranchise certain segments of the population from being able to express their voice, at the ballot. And I hear so many people that say it doesn't matter, or their vote's not going to make a difference. But it's like, no, this is what our ancestors, especially as African Americans, what they fought for, right? They took it very seriously. And there are people in society who are also taking it seriously enough to try to restrict that voice and to silence that voice. And so we have an obligation to take the gift of the vote and to use it, because every election, not just November for this year, and not just November of this year, but all of our local elections, the midterms, all of those things are a chance for us to let people know, actually, our communities do care where you place the grocery store, who gets
Mm-hmm.
the sidewalks, all of those things. But if people don't think that we are going to exercise our vote, then they're going to do things that are not in our interest, because they know that we're not going to actually do anything about it that matters.
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I want to challenge the people who say that your vote doesn't matter. I've heard that too
Mm-hmm.
many times from our community. If your vote didn't matter, why would they go through so much trouble to restrict our vote?
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
If we did not have real power, they would not even care if we voted or not. So the amount of energy and structures put in place to try to impede, restrict, and limit our vote or our voting power lets you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that our vote definitely does count, and they know it counts.
Oh, so
And I think the
so go ahead, go ahead.
and I think the thing that they know that we sometimes forget is that these local elections matter. So I could get with you if you were talking about a presidential election. Will your vote matter out of 100 million or 200 million or 300 million citizens? Okay, I can hear the argument. But when we're talking about your school board, that's sometimes 1,000 people voting for that,
Hmm.
and your vote does matter there. When we're talking about your state legislator or your local legislator for however your town does representative government, no, your vote is going to matter there. Sometimes we're talking about hundreds of votes when we look at some of these people who run unopposed, and because we're not even thinking about those different types of positions. There's one other thing that I want us to be thinking about there is that these state and local elections are also foundational for federal elections.
Hmm.
So when you're talking about people who move into federal government, they usually have state experience first. And so if you've got a really bad federal legislator, you probably could have cut that person off at the local level if you had been involved at the local level in voting. And so it's not, so yes, it is about your everyday. But even if you're somebody who's inordinately focused on what happens at the federal government, you should still be caring about what happens at the local level, because that's where those federal representatives come from. And so, either way, I think it becomes really important for us to be thinking about everything on the ballot and not just the things that tend to get the most attention.
I mean, and we saw it in the last election, in which the attempt to undermine the election, the attempt to overthrow the election, to not certify the election, and it's county officials who have the responsibility to certify elections for a particular county. But then, if they've been potentially indoctrinated in a certain way, then they are complicit with the attempt to undermine the vote, to undercut the vote. And so, yeah, it is very important. So that being the case, I believe there's 26 days left as of this broadcast before the election. What can we do as individuals? What can maybe we do as churches in terms of to make sure that our vote counts, to make sure that our voice is heard, to make sure that we do have representation and a seat at the table?
Well, I think one of the first things you need to do is make sure that you're registered to vote. Like I said, I just moved here, and when I got my license, I signed a paper and I was waiting, and my voter registration card did not come. I actually got up and drove, right?
Mm.
And the lady said to me, "Oh, we have thousands of voter registration cards to process." In other words, I may never have gotten it if I
Mm.
hadn't gone down there. So,
Hmm.
one, on the basic level, make sure you're registered to vote, and make sure your friends and your family, your children, that they're registered to vote.
Mhm.
That's the most basic thing we can all do.
And I think, after that, and I do think that's one of the most important things to do. But I think also, and it's something I said before, educate. Let's all take a couple minutes to see what's on the ballot,
Mhm.
so that we're not reading about it for the first time when we're actually making our vote, right? Let's educate ourselves. Let's make sure that we're educating others within our sphere of influence as well, right? Our family, our friends, our churches, because no matter where you're voting, there's more on the ballot than who is running
Mhm.
for presidency, right? And so we need to know what other things we're checking off when we're voting.
Mm. I agree with everything you're saying. I'm thinking about, as churches, what can we do as churches? Again, understanding the fine line between the fact that we are, tax exempt, etc., and we shouldn't be endorsing a particular candidate. But I think we do have a responsibility to educate, to let people know these are the issues. And not just these are the issues, but these are the potential impacts of the issues on your everyday life, your ability to, we think about, ability to worship, but also what you do with, how you teach your children, where they go to school and what they're able to do, etc. Am I kind of off in
Yeah,
my
you're,
thinking
you're,
here?
you're exactly
No, I
right. It's
think
like,
you're,
oh,
yeah. No, I was about to say, I think you're exactly right about that. And I think one of the things that the church can do um, is to also help combat misinformation. The
Mhm,
church as an institution, can help to hopefully be a clearinghouse for some of this, because it's getting harder and harder to figure out who's telling the truth.
mm,
And 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 I think the church, because the church has resources beyond what we as individuals uh, separately may have, if the church takes this role seriously, I think they can do a really good job of presenting an even-handed, fair assessment of what the playing field is, and what the ideas are, and what the agendas are, and what the platforms are. And I would argue that that is, for me, that should be the primary goal of the church, because we shouldn't be political actors that are sort of down in the dirt of elections and promoting candidates, and doing that type of thing. If we want to be engaged and help our parishioners do their civic duty, then what we should be saying is, the church is supposed to be a truth telling organization.
mhm,
So then let's get in the business of telling the truth, and helping parishioners sort through the lies and the misinformation and the mischaracterizations that happen as people are trying to do their best to get elected. Let's tell our people what the score really is, and then allow them to make up their own minds about who they want to support.
mm,
and churches can also be involved in, voter registration, right? There are many things churches can do that are nonpartisan, and the IRS has guidelines on that and kind of
mhm,
lays out, here's some things that religious organizations can do in 501(c)(3)s without, you know, impacting your that status. I also want to give a plug to my fellow Parl director at Southern Union, Amira Al Hadid, because
yes.
she prepared a very special edition of Waymarks dealing with that issue of how and what the parameters are for church engagement during this political season. It's on, I think, Southern Union's Pearl website, and
Mhm.
it's, I think, an excellent resource. And so I just encourage members to go there and read it. It's, maybe 5 pages. So it's a quick read and easy read, but it's very informative. So you have a great Pearl director and a great Pearl team within that union.
Thank you, thank you. So that's the www.southernunion.org, and you should be able to go to the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty section, and you'll see that in terms of that document there. Well, listen, as we're coming to a close, I want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of give uh, some closing remarks. Kind of with all that has been shared, some takeaways and some things that you want to leave with our audience. And I'll begin with you, Dr. Shaver, in terms of closing remarks when it comes to this upcoming election and voting rights, and even recognizing that in one way, shape, or form, somebody's going to win. There's a party, there's an agenda that's going to win, and there's a party and agenda that's going to lose. And
Mhm.
so, depending on what side you're on, how should we move forward as individuals within either climate?
Well, thank you again for having me on here. I
Mhm.
want to think about sharing experience of how local elections and local laws affect you. I'm a professor, administrator. I'm also a certified social studies teacher. So a couple of years ago, I went back into the classroom in Georgia and in a public school, and we had to go to an orientation. And that orientation spent the first 15 minutes telling us that we could no longer say anything really true about African American history or any type of history that people would find offensive. This is how state and local laws change. Just my job, what I had been doing for years, and now I can't do it authentically and ethically, in my opinion, right? So I want to leave you with this: doing nothing, it should not be an option, right? I know it's overwhelming to know what to do, but don't let doing nothing be an option, and don't let uh, the freedoms that people died for you to have go without being taken advantage of, because it's really precious, literally life or death.
Okay. Dr. Hines.
During this conversation, I was reminded of something that used to happen culturally back when I was a kid. And I don't remember exactly who I saw do this, but I know that it was done. You'd be talking in a circle with a bunch of black folk, and the conversation would end, and somebody would say, "The struggle continues."
Mhm.
Like as a closing, I wasn't like, okay, we're all going back to the struggle. We took this time to sit here and have this conversation about whatever we were talking about, but you know what, regardless of what we said here or what's going to happen tomorrow, the struggle continues. And it doesn't matter who wins in November. When you wake up the next day, guess what, the struggle continues.
Yeah.
And your side can win. And guess what? You now have to struggle to make sure that your agenda gets passed, that the people that you care about are actually going to be able to get help. Nothing gets solved the day after the election. We don't get to win and wake up and go, it's all better now. We voted and it's done.
Yeah.
Whatever you're passionate about, whatever you care about, whatever is the thing that motivates you in terms of what you want to see in the world and what you care about for other people, that fight will continue regardless of who wins. That doesn't mean you shouldn't vote, though. That fight could be easier or harder depending on how you vote.
Mhm.
And you should vote in a way that makes the playing field easier for you for the next amount of time. But at the end of the day, I take a certain amount of solace in the fact that regardless of who wins, the fight will continue. There will still be people here fighting for poor people, fighting for oppressed people, fighting for people who need things in this world, who are being forgotten and ignored. Martin Luther King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice.
Mhm.
But what I'm figuring out as I get older is that it doesn't bend on its own. It bends because we bend it. And that process continues. And so I encourage people to be informed, to go out and vote. That's a part of bending that moral arc, but realizing that voting is the beginning of the process. It's a waypoint, it's a way stop along the way, but it is never the conclusion. The struggle continues.
All right.
And building on that, I think that as believers, we need to remember ourselves and also remind our fellow believers that no matter the outcome of these elections, God is ultimately in control,
Amen.
right? And that means
Amen.
that we do need to do something. We do need to do our part, but we should not be living in anxiety and fear about these upcoming elections. God already knows the end from the beginning. He's called us to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly, but we
Yeah.
leave the outcome to him. He is already seen. And as Jason said, no matter which administration comes into power, the struggle will continue. But we know that God's already seen the end from the beginning in this.
That's right.
Amen. Amen. Dr. Shaver, Dr. Hines, Attorney Woods, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And we just hope and pray that we will continue to be on the forefront of the struggle to make lives better for everybody for as long as we can. So thank you for joining us. We'll be right back after this message. I'll give some closing thoughts. So as we wrap this episode up, we have 26 days before the general election. And whether we have already cast our vote, whether we're going to cast our vote, whether we are able to cast our vote, or in terms of eligibility, I do want to encourage you to encourage others to take up their civic duty to vote. And if you need to provide transportation for individuals to do so, then do so. But do whatever we can so that every vote counts and so that we can say that we had a part in this. Our next episode, our last episode for the season, is going to be on Wednesday. I believe it's, sorry, excuse me, Thursday. I believe it's November the 10th, in which we'll kind of look at the aftermath of the election. Hopefully by then we will know, um, who won. We'll know where things shake out in terms of the Senate and the House races, etc., and where we stand as far as that's concerned. And so we'll kind of do an overview of the what next. Where do we go from here in light of what has happened? So please look for that. Again, share this. Let somebody know. Share the link. um, go back and watch it and encourage others to watch it so that we can be informed. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for being a part of this. And I'll see you next time on the Public Square.